All right, well, give you guys a brief introduction while we're trying to get people set up here. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these axles. And I got this mock-up that I've made years ago. Actually, it wasn't that many years ago, it was just about a year ago. And it kind of shows the insides of the rear axle. You might have seen this if you've seen a video of mine. Got our ring gear, our pinion gear. So the big thing that we're going to go through when we're setting up is we're going to first set up our pinion depth. And our pinion depth shim is located right in there on the GM. Now some of you guys thought we were going through the Dana first, but I don't know why, but I decided to do the GM axle first. And but it really doesn't make a difference. The reason why we go through the GM and the Dana is because the really one big difference is that GM uses a collapsible spacer, and the Dana axles that we have, they use a shim in this spot. And we'll see what that does here in a second. But this is the axle assembly as we would see it in a vehicle. And what we're going to do is set it up, and the location of these gears, of the ring gear and the pinion gear, is extremely precise. So positioning this pinion gear and this ring gear in the right spot is essential. That's the reason why it's such a big deal. I talk about that there's really only 4 steps to setting up an axle, and it's going to be pinion depth. That's the first step. That's what we determine. The second step is pinion preload. That's going to be the clamp that's on these bearings. The third step is side bearing preload and backlash to make sure we have the right clearance between these gears. And then we do a contact pattern. So that's 4 steps. And it sounds pretty easy, and it is, but there's about 1 million sub-steps. So don't let the 4 steps part throw you off like it's super duper easy. A lot of students struggle understanding this concept, and it's probably the details that get them more than it is the actual overall concept. But the position of this pinion gear and this ring gear have to be pretty close together. If you're off maybe with the pinion depth 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch in either direction from where it's supposed to be, you're going to probably have a noise. And same thing with the backlash. Backlash is really important. Clearance. If you're too far away, you're going to create a noise, and if you're too close, you're not going to have enough room for lubricant. You're going to overheat the gear set. So, yeah, this is basically a cutaway of a GM axle, front to rear. You can see the transfer case and the transmission. So the engine, which isn't here, would deliver torque through the transmission, through its gear ratios, through the transfer case if you have one. This is for 4-wheel drive. Go through the drive shaft. I then would drive the rear axle assembly. Now the axle assembly, I cut these down and put the axle shaft, cut these axle shafts down so they could fit on a bench easy. Now one thing that you'll see when we do this bench work is that I don't have the axle shafts in, and before you take these parts out, you actually have to get the axle shafts out. And I've seen students, believe it or not, I've actually kind of done it myself, embarrassing to say, but you start taking these things apart and try to get the differential case out, and it doesn't want to come out, and then you realize, well, hell, I didn't pull the axles out. You get so used to working on these things on the bench the way we have them without any axles in them that you can sometimes forget something as silly and as simple as that. But anyway, to get the axle shafts out on this design, this is a Eaton locker, and this would be the same as an open differential or the same concept, is there's a C-clip that's located in there. And I have to pull this pin out. There's a bolt that retains that pin. And when I pull that bolt out, I can push the axle shafts in a little bit, let the clip come out, and I can pull the axle shafts out. So that's basically what that'll have to happen. And as you can see, this axle assembly that I have right here doesn't have the axle shafts in it. And I actually chopped these things off because I use the ends of those to finish building that. So anyway, little long and short of it. If you guys could post a comment on whether or not you can hear and see what I'm doing right now, that would be helpful, just to make sure that everybody's doing all right, logged in. So I see on Facebook, there's a couple people saying it's working. This is so exciting. Thanks, Ken, way out there in, where are you, Nevada now? Tyler, nice to see you. You're not even in the drivetrains class, but you're watching this. I appreciate it. Thomas, man, I'd love to have graduates watching this. We need to get Justin Morgan on here. He's the one that made me wear my pink shirt today because he promised he'd watch if I did that. So I'm glad to see you guys are on there, and I got a thumbs up on the on YouTube from Manuel Rise. Okay, excellent. So yeah, if you could give me, like, if you're on Facebook, give the thumbs up, or if you're on YouTube, a comment, whatever, just to make sure that everybody's seeing this okay. Well, this is the axle. This is a GM. It's called a 10 bolt because it's got 10 bolts holding on this cover. There's actually two different sizes of these 10 bolt axles. A smaller one, which is like a 7 5/8 diameter ring gear, that's going to be used on smaller vehicles like your S10 pickup trucks, and even your Camaros had it because they didn't have much room for an axle assembly. I'm talking about the older Camaros. And then there's the larger 10 bolts, which are more common, that you'll find in most half-ton pickup trucks. And we've got a variety of tools to help overhaul this. Now, a lot of people would ask, especially when you start going through this thing, and you start working on it, you'll, and as a student, you'll probably be like, man, there's people that like to do this stuff in the driveway, in their garage or something like that, and they have a hard time believing that that can be done. It is difficult to do, mainly because there's a few things that will pretty much require some special tools. The big thing is to get the bearings off, you need a press. The side bearings, you can usually use pullers. The pinion bearings, you might be able to destroy the bearing and use the puller to get it off, and as long as you're putting new bearings on, no big deal. But if you have to pull that bearing back off to change a shim, you might run into a situation where you're going to destroy another new bearing. Now, you can get presses pretty cheap. Harbor Freight sells them for between $100 and $200. And 3-jaw pullers or 2-jaw puller sets, they're cheap. So with the advent of Harbor Freight, really, and you know, us guys, we love to buy tools, right? So it's not a big deal to go out and buy some tools to keep in the garage. I don't really say that this is something that a do-it-yourselfer couldn't do. I think anybody really could do it, but you'd struggle a little bit if you didn't at least have a pretty good sized press, and you know, a puller set, and also this pinion nut that we're going to be taking off. That thing could be torqued down. It could have 300 foot-pounds of torque on it. So you're going to have some muscle, maybe a cheater bar. You might have to sacrifice something that if it ends up breaking, if you're lucky like me, you'll have larger tools, you know, like a 3/4 drive breaker bar or something along those lines. But I should probably wear safety glasses when I get into this, because you know how I get. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and start taking this thing apart. But one of the first things that you're going to want to do is some disassembly checks. And just really, you don't have to do this, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the condition of this axle was before you take it apart. And I'm going to show you on this board. I have, I don't know if these will, yeah, should come into view. I'll keep it right up there. There's 4 steps to setting up the this axle: pinion depth, pinion preload, side bearing preload and backlash, and contact pattern. We're going to go through all 4 of those steps. But first, before we do it, I'm going to want to just check a few things. One of the things that we're going to check is the contact pattern of this gear. And in order to do that, you're going to take some of this paint, and this is gear marking compound. When you buy a new a set of gears, it comes with a little bit of this gear marking compound and a little brush so you can smear it on. This is a GM part number. I guess for those of you guys that do it a lot, you might want to. Okay, let's see, boom. This is the GM part number. I don't know if that'll come into focus or not. I'll tell it to you. It's 1052351. And it's basically titanium dioxide paint. Titanium dioxide paint you can get at an art store or something like that. Now, you'll see some people say paint all the teeth. Well, I don't like to do that because it makes a mess and kind of wastes the paint, and for what we're doing, we don't need to have a bunch of teeth painted. So we're just going to paint a few teeth here. And I like to do this before and after, if for no other reason, for education's sake, that if we have to make an adjustment, we could see how the pattern changed. I mean, I could tell right now by moving this gear, there's a lot of backlash. I can hear it, and we got over 10,000, so it's excessive on the backlash. Matter of fact, this axle should have never, if this was built unless they were experimenting to see what a lot of backlash would create, it should never have gotten to the point where you would do a contact pattern, because if you have too much backlash, why would you bother doing a contact pattern? You'd want to lower that backlash down. Because I'm going to rotate this set of gears down where my pinion is, and I'm going to rub them back and forth. Now, just doing it by hand like that usually isn't going to have enough force to actually make a good impression on the paint. So you're going to have to use a ratchet and a wrench. And you're going to use the wrench on a ring gear bolt to move it back and forth, and you're going to use this ratchet to provide resistance. Now, this is one of those things that can you tap your head and rub your belly at the same time, because you're moving in this direction with this hand and in this direction with the other. So if I punch myself in the face, you guys will have this on video and you'll be able to laugh at it. It also likes to slip off, unless you got. All right. Oh, see, I'm going to pull that wrench right into my jaw if I miss. That'd be a good blooper reel there, huh? So I'm providing resistance so I can really wear those two gears together. Now, I only did it in one direction, so I'm going to have to flip my ratchet over and do it in the other direction, because I've got two sides to these gear teeth, right? It's going back and forth. So now, hopefully, I did that in the right spot. Okay, so I did, because sometimes you'll do it and you'll realize that you're in the wrong spot or you're missing the gear. I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see that pattern a little bit. Hopefully that shows up all right. Stay there, boom. Oh, maybe I'll rotate my gear a little bit. You can see this is the gear surface right there. And just to remind you guys of these gear tooth names, anything off to the outer part of this gear is called the heel. Anything towards the middle is the toe. Imagine your foot standing on that gear, and it would basically be like, you know, your heel would be on the outside of the gear and your toe would be on the inside. I'm going to zoom out so I can see a little bit better there. Okay. Now, towards the root, the base of this tooth is going to be the flank. Towards the top is going to be the face, and we call the pitch line smack dab down the middle. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this side is because this is the drive side. This is the side that's being pushed on when you're driving down the road and accelerating. This is one of the things that you also hear a lot of people talk about contact patterns, and they'll look at the drive side and the coast side, and then sometimes you'll see pictures where people will be only showing the coast side. And if you're going to build an axle, you're going to want to build it so that the drive side has the best contact pattern. Sometimes you will have a good pattern on the drive side, and when you look at the coast side, it just doesn't look ideal. But what are you going to do? You're not going to sacrifice the drive side pattern to make the coast side look better, because the drive side is seeing the torque from the engine. So anyway, right now, what you can see, this pattern right here is coming off the heel. See how it's coming right off the end of the gear tooth? You can see it's clean. The part that's cleaned out is the part that the gears were meshing on. So it's running right off the heel on all these teeth, and it's off to the face also. So it's kind of going off to the corner of this tooth. This gear would definitely make a noise. Whenever the contact pattern comes off of the gear tooth, it's going to create a little ringing sound. So it'd create a whining sound going down the road. It wouldn't be good. What would an ideal pattern be? An ideal pattern would be offset towards the toe, definitely not towards the heel. It would be in the middle of the gear, meaning centered across between the face and the flank. I like to say that the gear is going to spend just as much time on the face side of the pitch line as it does on the flank side of the pitch line. And the reason why is because sometimes these patterns aren't perfectly oval. Sometimes they're kind of like a parallelogram or something. And to stare at those, you're trying to figure out, is it towards the face, is it towards the flank? Well, if you draw an imaginary line down the middle of this gear, where the pitch line is, as long as there's just as much wear or contact below the pitch line as there is above it, you can consider it centered from face to flank. So it should go half of the length of the tooth, be offset towards the toe, not run off the gear in any direction, and spend as much time on the flank as it does the face. So those are kind of some general rules. As you can see, this would fail the contact pattern because it's pushed off way there towards the heel and even off towards the face. So that wasn't zoomed in too much for you guys to see it, but that was, that's that. Do you guys have any questions? Make sure you post them up. I've got our fearless leader of the automotive program is over here. He is monitoring the computers for me. So you could say hi to everybody.
Hey everybody.
And he's making sure that, well, he's making sure that if there's any questions that they don't get lost or skipped or something like that. Now the next thing I'm going to do before I tear it down is check my backlash, the actual movement or the clearance that I've got in this gear. If you guys remember, backlash is there because we need oil, room for oil to get between these gears. And it's a critical measurement, it's a critical part to setting this axle up. And as I mentioned before, that unless you're just doing an experiment, there's really no reason why anybody should have done a contact pattern on this gear when they put it together with loose backlash. And I could tell just because I've jiggled these gears enough times that this backlash was high. All right, now this is a little snake with a dial indicator. Yes, this is another one of those tools that you will need to have if you are working on these. You can't guess at backlash in some of these measurements. But if you're the type of person that's willing to take on an axle assembly in your backyard, you're probably the type of person that's also willing to go out and buy some tools. And like I said, if love it or hate it, Harbor Freight has really kind of helped the backyard guy out because the tools are a lot cheaper. And if you're not using them every day, you probably don't need to have the most expensive tools in the shed. Let's switch to the boom. Now this has got the dial indicator on it. I don't bother zeroing it because I can do simple math in my head. Not to sound like with an ego or anything like that, but you can see I'm going between 14 and 29. So what is that? That's 15 thousandths of an inch. So that's way too much backlash. If you look at the specs, and of course you'd always want to use your service information. I haven't looked this up, and I always forget, even though I teach this every year. But the backlash is supposed to be probably, I'm going to guess between 5, oh, no, that's something different. It's going to be between like 5 and 8 or 6 and 9 thousandths, right there. 5 and 9 thousandths. So backlash, oh, hold on, am I zoomed in? There we go. So backlash is between 5 and 9 thousandths for all new gear sets. I don't know why they say that because it's not like they gave you a spec for a used gear set, but 15 thousandths. Now this is just in one spot. I'm going to want to go through and check it in a bunch of different spots. So I usually rotate the pinion about a half of a turn and then I do the check again. I'm going from 15 to 20, or 5 to 20, so that's 15 thousandths still. And then I'm going from, let's see, 12 to 26, there's 14 thousandths.
Can you show on the dial indicator where it's positioned at on the tooth? They don't see that in the video.
Okay, yeah. That's a good point. Somebody mentioned, can I show on the video where I'm contacting on the tooth? I was zoomed in too far. So I'm touching the drive side, and the reason why I'm on the drive side, I could be on the coast side, but if you look, the coast side of this gear has got a kind of a steeper angle. And the drive side of the gear is more like parallel to the rotation. Since I'm moving this gear, like, this direction, I'm on the drive side because it's all that movement is going straight into the dial indicator. If I was on the coast side and kind of hitting it straight on, I wouldn't be measuring the true, rotational, I don't know what direction you call this, I guess a rotational direction of this gear set. So yeah, I'm on that, and that's why when I lifted it up and I moved it half of a turn, I'd get back onto that gear and then I'd measure it again. And pretty much everything is between 14 and 15 thousandths of an inch. But that is a good question. Where was I measuring in the gear? I zoomed in too far, and now this is also another thing that messes people up. Sometimes the preload is set up really high on these bearings, and when you go to move them, like right now, if I go to move this just with light force, I don't get anything. You might have been able to hear it go clunk, 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 clunk when I'm forcibly moving it. But if I just grab this gear and move it, you don't hear anything because there's a squeeze, there's a clamp on these bearings, there's preload on it. So you actually sometimes have to grab it and make sure there's movement there, especially after it's been set up, because once it's been set up, the side bearing preload could kind of get you there. All right, so I got the gear contact pattern off to the face and towards the heel, and I've got my backlash, which was 14, 15 thousandths, that's high. So now I'm going to go ahead and take my bearing caps off. I'll zoom out a little bit more. Actually, before I zoom out, I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to show you guys, these things have already been marked, these bearing caps, and kind of like main bearings on an engine, the caps only go on in one spot. I mean, they'll go in other spots, but they'll go in and it'll be wrong. They get machined in place, so if I take this cap and put it on the other side, I'm going to have alignment issues, and I might distort the bearing and have an issue with it. So the first thing I like to do is just take a look at an axle before I take it apart and see if there's some factory markings indicating which direction or which side they go on. If not, you want to put a mark yourself. A little chisel punch, a little pin punch, like a letter punch. But you can see this has a center punch here. Somebody put a dot there, and somebody put a single dot there. And on the other side, even though you really only had to do probably one side, on the other side, somebody put 2 dots and 2 dots. So that way you know they're in the right, on the right side, in the right direction, and so forth. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull these caps off. This is on these GM 10 bolts. It's still, I don't know, this is the newest axle I probably have, I think, and it's in early 2000s. I don't know at what point, but they probably switched to metric. I'm just guessing, but these are all standard sizes. Not like you couldn't make a metric ratchet work on it, or a socket work on it. This is a 5/8 of an inch. You can do this in the car. I just do it on the bench because that's where our units are. Matter of fact, most of the units we have are chopped down so they don't take up as much space. We have a little rack that we store them on. Now, if you're doing it in the car, I always recommend you take these caps off, and then when you're done, take 2 bolts and just thread them in here. You could probably guess why I have you do that. Because if it's in the car and this is all open, and remember, this would be positioned, I don't know if I can slide this, but no, I can't, it's too tight. But this would be like up this way. So this opening would be facing out. So gravity could let this stuff fall out if it was loose. Well, if you thread this in a few turns, you can still get this out, but if it falls, it's going to land on these bolts, and it's not going to fall and hit the floor. That is a big, oh, that's gone forever. That's a big deal. Now, I can't just go in there and lift this out. It's in there tight. If you remember, these bearings are squeezed. They're preloaded by these shims that you see on either side here. So how do I get this out? Sometimes you'll see people prying on it. They'll get a big old pry bar, and you might be able to get underneath the diff case and pry it out. You might not have room to do that depending on how the vehicle's set up or if you don't have any openings. There is a trick that you can do, and you have to do this. You put a wrench on a ring gear bolt, and it has to be on the top of the axle housing. The way this is mounted, this is the top, and you're going to be like, well, how do you know that? If I spin this around a little bit, maybe you can see the pinion is offset to this side, to the, away from me. This would normally be the bottom of the vehicle. So they offset the pinion on these high point gear sets down. That allows the drive shaft basically to sit a little lower, and it creates less of a clearance issue. So I can look at this and say, okay, this is the bottom of the axle housing, this is the top of the axle housing. I'm going to put a wrench on a ring gear bolt on the top of the axle housing. I could try this by hand, it might not work, but if I rotate the drive pinion, it might spin it right out. Now, it still didn't want to come out. If you heard my shoulder pop, because I tried too hard, I'm an old man. So I'm going to spin this with a wrench or a ratchet, or a breaker bar or a ratchet, and you're going to see this, this diff case pop out. Now remember, I mentioned to you before, you want to have the axle shafts out. This is where you can get ahead of yourself. But so see how it just spun that out? Isn't that kind of nice? Doesn't come all the way out, but it usually comes out far enough so you can get something under these shims and get the shims out of there. As soon as you get some of these shims out, then it'll all be loose. So really, once you get one shim out, it'll be easier to pull all these out. So I know my bearing caps are marked, so I can put those kind of out of the way. And maybe I'll go back to the... All right, you see me live again here. So I'm going to pull these out. Hopefully I won't lose any fingers in the process. This is one of those parts where when you take it out, you hear things falling on the floor because it's hard to lift this out. This thing probably weighs, I don't know, probably 30 pounds. So you don't want to get your fingers in the wrong spot. If you look, it's like, man, there's a lot of shims in this thing. That's actually not typical. Usually, these are the shims I pulled out right here. I got this going on. So I got 4 shims on each side. That is not typical. It's not usually how these things are set up. And usually you just have one shim when you take it out for the first time. Here's an example of it. This is a cast iron shim. It's basically the one that comes from the factory. And you can see here, it's just one piece. And they figure out the size that it needs, and they've got little markings on them and so forth. But the reason why these are, let me take a step back. When you replace these, you end up putting 2 shims in there. And this is the way the OE does it. So you don't necessarily have to do it this way. When you buy a new ring and pinion, it comes with the install kit, or if you buy the install kit, it comes with shims to put in place of it, and they're a little different than this. But like from General Motors, you would get this, which is called a service spacer. They're all 170 thousandths of an inch thick. And then you put a service shim next to it. So the combination, and then the shims will go from 40 thousandths to 100 thousandths. So you have the overall thickness between these two of being 210 thousandths all the way up to 270 thousandths. So they end up replacing these shims, these one-piece deals. They say don't reuse them because they're cast iron and they can crack. I've used them. Really, they're not going to go anywhere. So it's, even if they did crack, they're captured between the bearing and the housing. So I personally would never throw these out because sometimes you are missing a shim or something and you need the size, and you might just happen to have a selection of these over the years of rebuilding them, and then you have the right combination of size, so use it. So this is what they're supposed to have. Now the reason why I'm going to guess that we've got a stack of shims here is if you take a look at the diameter of this shim, it fits in there nice. And then if you compare it to like this service spacer, it's actually a little bit bigger, the shim is. Because at some point GM, they made their side bearings larger. And so a lot of these kits, these shim kits that I've got, don't necessarily work with like these service spacers. If I tried to use this in here, it wouldn't fit right. Probably part of it would try to fall into the axle tube. So I can't use these on this. So my guess is whoever set this up last, I've got some of the larger shims, but they ended up making their own basically service spacer. And you could do it. Like these are all 60 thousandths of an inch. So if I put 2 60s and a 50 together, I got 170 thousandths. So I'm just wasting a lot of shims though, that's the only thing. You can buy these. I don't have the part numbers or anything like that, but these, and this is something we probably need to get for these, this is the only axle I got that's got the bigger gears, bigger bearings. But basically getting the 170 thousandths service spacers, they're available. and they replace the cast iron ones. All right, enough on that. All right, got that out. Now the next step is, so my diff case is out, I need to get my drive pinion out. See, I told you something. That was that bolt that fell in there. Let me get that down. Okay. All right, so here's the bolt. That was one of the cap bolts. We need to loosen this up. This is that pinion nut. This thing could have hundreds of pounds of torque on it because when they set these up, General Motors, they have that collapsible spacer in there, an established preload. We'll see that here in a minute. So when you actually take this apart for the first time, this thing is going to have a ton of torque on it because in the process of tightening this pinion up at the factory, if somebody went through it before, they have to crush that sleeve down. They crush it to the point where the bearings are spaced the precise amount away from each other so they get the right preload. And that usually requires a lot of torque. Switch to this boot, or switch camera positions here. So this tool here is a yoke holder. It keeps, allows me to hold this yoke assembly in a position. There are other types. There's types that you can put bolts and so forth into. And then I'm going to use my breaker bar. Like I said, the breaker bar might not be enough. I know it will be on these because we don't reuse, we don't put new collapsible spacers in every time we do this because it's kind of a waste, and we'd tear the threads up on the pinion because of all that torque it takes to crush that sleeve. You'll see what I mean about that sleeve here in a second. I'll show it to you. But so when we reuse these, sometimes we'll tap out the collapsible spacer just to kind of reuse it, but it won't take a ton of torque for this one. All right, so it's a little bit more, but you know, I'll just have to get tough with it. Okay, there we go. I'm gonna guess it was about 350, 400 foot-pounds, but I got it all right. No sweat. I've seen students, and it's kind of funny to watch. They'll have one person holding the yoke holder, one person pulling the breaker bar, and even if you guys are both strong, the balance is what screws you up. You're almost better off doing it yourself. And you wouldn't do it like to try to loosen it in the position I have it now. You'd want to have it like right next to each other like this. And even better, more like this. Why? Because if I'm over here and it breaks loose, I might rake my knuckles across this tool and leave a layer of skin on there. I think that's what this is right here. Somebody's skin. I'll peel it off. That's pretty gross, but... Okay, so spin this guy out. Now this thing is tight coming off all the way because the nut they use from the factory, these pinion nuts, have this distortion that they do to the top of it. I'll show you that. So this is that pinion nut, and if you look close at it, it's not perfectly round. They crimp in 3 spots, and that makes it tight. So that way it's like a locking nut. Okay. Now if you look, this just doesn't fall apart. It just doesn't come out on us. So what we have to do is tap this out. And you use a brass drift and a hammer. And I'm going to go ahead and start tapping this down. Now normally you would have somebody put their hand underneath there and kind of catch the pinion. I'll see how this goes. I tell students to usually put their foot underneath there to catch it, but they don't listen to me. And if they start dropping things, I tell them to bring their pillow from at home so that way they can put it underneath whatever they're working on. It's about ready to come out. I'll probably be able to tap it the rest of the way. Now, Mr. Behrman was back there. He's freaking out because he just can envision the chip painting, the paint chipping off the floor, and it's freaking him out. But I caught it. It's all right. Don't have panic attack. But okay, now look. I'm going to take this. This is a yoke, right? I'm going to take it off. I'm missing a seal, and the seal is normally here, but because these are units that we go through in class, there is no seal. So normally this would come out and I would have a seal and then my bearing. So this is the rear or front pinion bearing. This is the yoke. When I tighten the nut down, it pushes that front bearing towards the rear. That's going to end up pushing that bearing. Try not to drop all this stuff. It's going to end up pushing this bearing up against this spacer, start crushing that spacer, and it's going to bring these two bearings closer and closer together. Once these bearings are close enough to the point where they are pressing up against their bearing races tight, that's when we get our preload. And we'll see that when we go back together with it. But right now we're just taking stuff apart. So, at this point we have our axle housing disassembled, taken apart. And if I were rebuilding this thing from scratch, just like you'd be doing if you overhauled this thing, you'd take the brass drift and you'd be pounding out your bearing races. This would reach in there and grab that rear outer race, pound it out, going from the other side and pound the other bearing race out. We don't need to do that because this is just a little demonstrator unit. But if you got a overhaul kit and it come with bearings, you'd want to replace obviously all the bearings. Now on the differential case, this is right here, in this spot right there, you can see they put a little notch. Zoom in a little bit there for you. This gives you room to put a 2-jaw puller kind of right into that spot. And you can put one jaw and one jaw on the other side, put a little spacer there, and you can pull these bearings off. It's really nice when the manufacturers give you those little slots to go into. If they don't, then what ends up happening is you have to use a bearing separator like we're going to do here on the pinion bearing, and you'll probably destroy that bearing. I've actually gone through, like on the Danas, you'll see tomorrow, they don't provide this little spot, and I've done something different on that, but on the ones that we've done for live jobs, I've gone in there with a die grinder and made little notches because the shims on the Danas live between the diff case and the bearing. So if your shim combination isn't right and you have to change it, you have to take that bearing back off. Well here, if I have to take this bearing off because I'm replacing it, putting a new one in from the kit, if I destroy it, no big deal. I put a new one on and I'm good to go. I'll never have to take it off again. But on the Danas or on some other axles, depending on where they put their shims, you'll have to take that bearing off again. That's no good. All right, so now we're at this point, everything's out of the housing. Let's pretend we just replaced these outer races. Now I've got to go through, and I'm still disassembling, but I got to go through and I got to get this rear pinion bearing off. There's a shim that lives under, okay, I'm not underneath my camera, there we go. There's a shim that lives between the head of the bearing, or the head of the pinion and the bearing. It's right there in that little groove. You can see it's silver in there. That little shim is in there and I need to know what size it is. This is one of those things where if you were rebuilding these in your garage or your driveway or something like that, and I say you need a press, if you're like, well, I'm just going to buy new bearings and a new pinion and I'll just pound a bearing, I don't need to press the old one off. You do actually, because you need to be able to figure out what size shim this is. If you remembered from the lectures online that we will use, and I'll demonstrate using special tools to set up this axle, but in most cases, you're going to reuse this shim because the shim that's in here makes up for the differences in machining in the housing more than it does the differences in machining in the pinion and the ring gear. And the reason why I say that, if you look, this drive pinion is 100% machined. And I'll guarantee you the equipment that they're using to machine this pinion gear is very high tolerance. There's a precision piece of equipment. So when they make this, it's going to be pretty good. If it's off, it's probably only a thousandth or two in either direction. That probably wouldn't screw you up. Sometimes the manufacturers will go through and say, yeah, we made that one a little too small or too big, and they'll put an etching on the head of the pinion. This 8.5-inch GM doesn't do that. The newer ones do. They're called variances, and you will basically adjust your pinion's shim measurements, or even if you're replacing it, you'll adjust it based off of that variance. But on this axle, on this GM one here, we don't have any variance. So I'm going to take us over to the press, and we're going to press that off. If you guys, any other questions so far?
Probably put a battery in too.
What percent are we at?
Like 20.
Oh, we're good right now. Once I go to the boom, if we could switch it out. All right, we are, I know you're probably getting a close-up view of me right now, but we're at the press. And I am going to put, this is a little mini guillotine here. I'm going to put this, whoa, another thing that's going to cut your fingers off if you're not careful. Got a lot of those around here. So this is one of those tools that you have to respect quite a bit. Now pressing these bearings off isn't that big of a deal. The hydraulic press, man, they can create 25 tons. That's 50,000 pounds of force. And you don't want to be around something that shatters or breaks when there's 50,000 pounds of force on it. So just kind of realize that when you're working around a press, have a little respect for it. I've almost peed my pants a few times working at this press. The last time was pulling bobcat axles off, the hubs off the axle shafts. That took pretty much, I got it to the red zone, the danger zone, and then I had to put a torch on it. And then when it finally popped off, it scared the death out of me. But I even made a little scatter shield around it because I was worried it was going to kill me. But I'm here to live and show that I lived through it. Now this is an adjustable press. This is not going to be your Harbor Freight special if you end up getting one. So don't expect it to be as nice as this, but I'm sure it'll get the job done. I don't know if I went far enough down yet. Yeah, that's good. Now, I'm going to point this out real quick. The way I have this set up now, and you guys could probably see that, comment up there if you see something that doesn't seem quite right. Like if I were to continue to do this, which I could and it'd probably work fine on this, is there something that I'm doing wrong? I know there's a bit of delay by the time you see it and I record it, but so what I'm basically going to point out is that if you look the way I have this thing set up, the force pushing down on this pinion is going to be exposed to this threaded bolt assembly. The bolt is big, but it's not really designed to carry the tonnage of force that I'm going to be putting on it. So I don't want to have this bearing separator set up on my press like this. I want to have it set up like this. So really the only thing that the bolts are doing is squeezing these two together. And the press itself is, the force is going through the pinion to the splitter halves and then to these little pads that they're sitting on. Also, when you're using this press, make sure that, zoom back out, make sure you lower it down on these little pins. Because if you take this up and down to change the height of these pins and you forget to lower it, you're going to be putting on the force on these little cables. And we've broken these cables before because of that. So I'm going to go ahead and push it down. I want to get my hand underneath there to catch it. Okay, so I got my bearing off and I got my pinion gear. Now if you look, this is what we were trying to get to. This is the shim. The shim is 38 thousandths. And the reason why I know it's not because I'm feeling, I don't have my micrometer fingers, but the eyesight's not going as good though. There's actually on these GMs, probably won't be able to see that too well, but I'm trying to reflect the light into it. Right where I'm reflecting the light, that has a 3/8 stamped on it. It's kind of nice, they stamped that for you, 38 thousandths. All right, And I'll take this back. I'll be back here in a second. All right. So now actually we've got everything 100% taken apart. And I'm going to use these special tools to figure out what I do with them. There's a box sitting somewhere. There they are. Okay. All right, I didn't mean to step away from the camera, but this is a special tool kit. And maybe I can move this boom over to show us what we're looking at on that. I know this is going to be crooked looking and weird, but I got everything kind of stacked up here. These kits aren't cheap, but going back, I like kind of sharing this whole backyard mechanic idea with you guys. Because I do think this is something that you could do in your own garage if you're into this stuff. This kit isn't something that you're going to go out and buy. I think it's over $1,000, but you really don't need it. If you think of what most people are doing when they set up axles, is they're going through and changing gear ratios, putting a new differential case with a locker in it or something like that. This kit right here is to set up a bare housing like we've got sitting over here. And it's to figure out what size shim to start with, basically. And I have the students do this in our class just because, you know, this is part of the process, and at a dealership they do have these tools. The dealers, I don't know if they use them too much, but the dealers do have these tools to set them up and find out where what the shims are supposed to be. And just like in the lectures, I do mention, when do you use the special tools? It's when you're uncertain about the way it was set up in the past, and it's also when you're getting a new axle housing, but you're keeping the gears. Or, you know, really, if you're just getting a new housing, you're going to need to do it anyway. It gives you a starting point. And what this, you can see I partially assembled this. This is going to mimic a perfect ring gear center line. This sits in where the bearing, the differential case, the side bearings go in, and this is actually going to end up hitting the pinion depth tool. And then this is going to mimic a perfect drive pinion. So I need to assemble this up. I'll actually have to use that bearing that I pressed off. So here's my bearing. I need to find a spacer that fits in there perfectly. Uh-oh. Thought I checked all this. Apparently I didn't. Okay, we're gonna improvise. In the other kit, I didn't bring all the kits over in the other lab. There's one that fits into this spot perfectly. Do you know where those are at, Mike? You know where the table is in there that had the little green file folder, just like right inside the door? There's a couple kits. Even that, there's one that's just a Tupperware. He's going to come back and get it. So that way we can put it together correctly. And like I said, we don't need these special tools. The special tools are just one of those things that will basically tell us where to start. You're almost always better off using the shim that it came with. Because like I said, the axle housings are the part that are variable in a sense. And to talk about using these special tools, and a lot of people think, well, okay, when I get an axle and I overhaul it, I'm going to need these special tools to do it. Not true, because even when you set an axle up from the very beginning, I don't even use a ring or a pinion to set it up. I use this tool to establish the ring gear center line, and I use this tool to establish a pinion. So when I get done, the only thing I've used was a bearing in the axle housing and then the toolkit. And then when I'm done, I get a reading, but that reading doesn't have anything to do with the actual pinion itself. All it did is look at the housing. All it did is look at the housing and give you a number. Oh, thank you, sir. And then this is the one I was looking for. If you take a look, it fits nicely inside this bearing. So this is going to end up threading on here. And then I'm going to have basically the pinion, if we want to call this the pinion, This is going to simulate it. And what this does now is it basically is going to hold that bearing centered, hold that tool centered in there, so that way when I go back together, when I go in with this, I have this pinion sitting in there just like it would be in an axle in the assembled unit. And then this perfect ring gear center line is going to position itself on what this perfect pinion would be, and then I'm going to get a reading. You'll see how that happens. On this, this one here actually has 4 different heights, as you probably noticed. And the reason why they do that is because this tool will work on 4 different, hold on 1 second there. This tool will work on 4 different axles. Actually, it'll work on way more than that. But it has the size listed. And on this tulip here, it says 8 7/8, 8 1/2, 8 1/8, 9 3/8. There's actually this adapter here that works on the smaller ones. It says 6 1/2, 7 5/8, 7 1/2. So by the time I'm done with that, Mike, you can change that bearing or that battery if you want. It's low on that one. But since this is an 8 1/2, I'm going to use this. So basically, like I said, this is sitting in this axle housing like it's a pinion, a perfect drive pinion. It's probably why these tools cost so much, is because everything here has got to be pretty precise. Now I'm going to take my perfect ring gear center line and I'm going to position it in there. Since the pinion is offset to that side, I like to put the part that's going to contact it offset to that side as well. And I do need to put my bearing caps back on. I don't need to like torque them down or anything like that, just kind of snug them up. Figure out what to do with the bolts. Because just a little bit of debris underneath these little side bearing things, that could hold it up, could lift it up a little bit. Stuff everywhere. So, are there any questions coming in there, Mike? Or is everything... Wow, you guys, I must be doing a great job. That's the only thing I can think of. So if this was just a axle, you're just changing out a diff case in to go from an open diff to a locker or something like that, you wouldn't be doing this process. You wouldn't be going through and using the special tools. As I mentioned, the only time you'll use these special tools is if you are uncertain about who set it up and you just can't trust that pinion shim that's in there at all. If the thing had a relatively low mileage and it's already creating noise, or if you got a new axle housing. Oops. Oh shoot, I forgot about that. This has got the bigger bearings. I don't know if this one will work then. Should have taken that into consideration. Alright, so we might have to skip past this part. As I mentioned, the tools have this has to simulate a perfect ring gear center line. And this is the one axle I've got. Probably should have grabbed a different one. This is the one axle I got that's got a little larger side bearings than the others that I have. And I don't know if I have the parts that go with this kit. I don't think I do actually. I'll take a peek here in that kit. There might be some bigger discs, but no, because this side won't, well, hold on, that side won't fit in there. It's just too, it's meant for a bigger axle housing. Well, let me try it. I'm going to see if this is it's close, but I don't think so. But we'll try it. What's the worst that can happen? Actually, I think that might be right. I might have just had it on backwards. We'll find out here in a second, because if the reading's going to have to be between basically 30 thousandths or so and 50 thousandths, because anything other than those two extremes, they don't make pinion shims for. Actually, I think 25 thousandths is the smallest. But in all these axles I've ever taken apart, I've never seen one go below the 30s, and I've never seen one go above the 30s. They're always in the 30s. So, and I guess that's worth looking at or knowing, because if you're rebuilding one of these and you don't have the tools, if you started at like say 35 thousandths, you'd probably be pretty close. I've never experimented with that, but okay, yeah, I think that'll work. Looking down, now I got the little pad that says 8.5. It's right underneath this little the ring gear, the arbor assembly I have here. So right now I need to put a dial indicator on this. And this tool right here is the dial indicator. That one's kind of sticky. I'm going to grab the one out of the other kit. Okay, so these things are actually not cheap. So that's one of those that you just like don't want to drop them. I'm going to put this on there so that way I'm squared up on it. I'm going to make sure it rotates on the dial a little bit and then tighten it up. Not a position I normally put my hands in. Okay. And so at this point, I've got this dial is sitting on this pad. You can see I got full motion. One of the things I see people mess up on every once in a while is they'll tighten the dial indicator on, and there'll be a gap between the dial indicator and this plunger. You got to make sure there's no gap. So I'm going to lift this tool, basically. I have to lift the plunger up and get it on that pad. And you can see I'm going to rock it back and forth. And the point, you want to move, you zero this out when the dial goes to the point of highest deflection. So I'm going to zoom in on this.
And how do you know which of those 4 pads do you use?
If you looked close, they actually have the size of the axle stamped on it. So I know I'm working on an 8.5 inch 10 bolt GM, and the 8.5 inch is referring to the diameter of the ring gear. So I know it's an 8.5 inch GM, so I'm on this pad that says 8.5 down there. That's a good question though. So now I got this plunger sitting on the pad. I'm going to rotate it up to the point where it deflects the highest, meaning I'm arcing this thing back and forth, and when I get to the point where it's completely vertical, that plunger is stuck up all the way, and then okay, I'm going to zoom out because you can't see my hand motion there. When this thing's, when you're rotating that arbor, this back and forth, you're moving that plunger up to the point where it's vertical, and then it's going to go back down, and go the other direction, goes vertical, then goes back down. So the highest deflection is when I move it from one position, I see the needle climb, and then it starts going back down. When this thing is perfectly straight up from that arbor, that little pad down there, that's going to be the point where the number's going to read the highest. So at this point, right now, I'm at 56. But I don't really care about what number it's on because I'm going to zero it at that point. So basically, I'm zeroing it at the point of highest deflection. Zero, then down, zero, then down. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let it come off of that pad. And the number that it reads on the dial is the shim that you need. It almost seems like a magic trick, really. And if you look, that says 39 thousandths. If you remember what shim was in it to begin with, this guy, it was 38 thousandths. Let's see if I can get the light to make it, oh, right there. So it's actually pretty close, within a thousandths from what they were saying. So this tool is kind of interesting. It allows you to basically take the axle housing without a pinion, without a ring gear, take a housing and figure out what size shim it needs. So if you had this like in if you were just stocking these or something, building them for customers and you didn't necessarily know the application, you could just write 39 thousandths on this and know that whatever pinion you're going to end up putting in here that you're going to put a 39,000 shim in there to start with. So, and that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and find a 39,000 shim, put it in there. This right here is a kit that we've got out at school, and I have a variety of shims in there. So 39 is probably going to be one of these. There we go. Here's an example of something that's kind of odd, that if you look, somebody's gotten rough with this. Maybe the bearing separator hit it or something. It's got a burr on it. So whenever you use shims, this is kind of generic overall, almost common sense, but people forget it all the time, is if you put something in there that's got a big old fat burr on it, it's not going to act like 39,000 shim anymore. It's going to act like whatever thickness that was, that part with the thickest part basically. So if you're doing this for kind of a customer and so forth, which I assume you would, you might want to have a file handy, run it over the edges just to make sure you don't have a high spot, because you don't want that 39,000 shim acting like a 44,000 shim or something like that. So we'll put that in here in a second. I'm going to take these tools out. Are there any questions about the this pinion depth setup? Feel free to ask. Comment up. So like if I was rebuilding my Tahoe, putting a 10 gear set in it or something like that, because I put a big old supercharged LS engine or something like that, I wouldn't mess with this, because my Tahoe, it's got 300,000 miles on it, and I can trust that it was set up right from the factory. If I can go, heck, if you can go more than 100,000 miles on an axle without it making noise, you can trust that it was set up right from the factory. And I would just use the pinion shim that was in it. Even with the new gear, if it's off, it's only going to be off a little bit, and the tool wouldn't have helped you. The tool would have probably told you to put whatever you had in it. Okay, so I'm just stripping this thing down to the parts real quick, and we're going to start going back together with it. At this point, we already know what our pinion depth shim is, so that's kind of our first step. If you remember, going back to the steps of what we're supposed to be doing here. That very first step is pinion depth. Seems like, oh my gosh, spent all this time and you only gone through one step. Remember, we had to disassemble, and we did some of the disassembly checks in the process. So now we're actually going back together. I'll grab my 39,000 shim. I just deburred, put it on the drive pinion, and there's my bearing. I am going to just pound this on with a pipe. You could use a press, but I'm not gonna. Now this one right here, it says no hammer, and then this is the side you hit, because you'll end up burring these things over really bad. And before you put that bearing on too, probably a good idea to make sure your pipe will go all the way down. Gosh, that didn't go all the way down, does it? Okay, let's, yeah.
A couple of questions here. Is it true that torsion style 10-volt differentials are inherent for making noise?
Well, the torsion differential is basically what's going on inside the differential case. It goes on in here. Like this is an Eaton locker. So the torsion part is in here. It's a set of worm gears that go in there. It's there for limited slip. So if you got an axle that's making noise going in a straight line, it doesn't really matter if it's a torsion or if it's a open or limited slip or anything like that, or a locker. If it's only making noise during turns, then yeah, then that torsion, I haven't really heard of problems with those, so I don't think those are big issues. But if you've got a noise that's going in a straight line, it's because of the ring in the pinion or the bearings. And the biggest thing about noises, the noise complaints that you hear about most are when people change gear ratios and they use aftermarket gears. I'm not saying aftermarket gears are bad, but not all gears are equal. I don't want to say names or anything like that. Like there's a lot of aftermarket companies, US Gear, Yukon, Richmond, and some of them are just noisier than others, and it's probably due to the shape, the way they've cut their teeth. And there isn't necessarily a problem with that. Like, so if it's set up properly and your contact pattern is good and it seems to be a little noisier than what was in it, it's probably just the gear set design. OE, if you take and you buy an OE gear, this is an American Axle manufacturing, so if you went out and bought an AAM gear, it's probably going to be as quiet as it was from day one from the factory. But if you go out and buy an aftermarket one, it might have a different sound to it. But yeah, so you'd have to diagnose the noise. Is it something that's happening only on curves? If it is, then it is something with the diff. But Torzens are usually really quiet. They're really good gear sets.
And is it common to rebuild the inside of a differential case?
Yes. Limited slip. The question was, is it common to rebuild the inside of a limited or a differential case? If you have an open differential case, and I'll show that tomorrow with the Dana stuff, because this is a locking mechanism here and it doesn't have the open style. On an open type, there are measurements that you're going to do, basically to see if the gears are worn out and if there's excessive clearance. And the measurements might include basically putting a dial indicator on a side gear and moving it back and forth and seeing how much slop it is and comparing it to specs. Or more commonly, they'll have you stuff a feeler gauge and see how much of a gap you have between the case and the gear. Because if the teeth wear out, they'll establish more of a gap. Another area that's common for some differential cases to wear is this pinion shaft pin will elongate or egg shape the differential case. And if that happens, this thing's popping back and forth every time you accelerate and decelerate, and it creates a clunking sound, and that's no good. If you have an open differential and you get stuck on ice, or you like doing one tire fire burnouts, you might end up destroying these gears, because these gears are really meant to, an open differential, these gears are really meant to just account for the differences in wheel speed when you're turning, or when one wheel goes over a bump and the other wheel doesn't. So it's not meant to basically run together like you would see a ring and a pinion. If you think, like, if you got caught on ice, and you probably have noticed this, like I got one tire spin like crazy and you saw your speedometer go up to 60 miles an hour, there's a good chance that one wheel was going 120 miles an hour and the other wheel was going 0. So if you imagine what was going on in this gear set here, these gears are sitting there spinning like crazy, and you've got a lot of, there's no bearings around them or anything like that. It's just a steel gear around a steel pin, so it's really bad for it. So yeah, that's what you'll want to inspect when you take it apart. If you have a limited slip differential, the limited slip clutches can wear out over time, and the way you check those, and there's a separate lecture on that I have that's on limited and locking differentials. But you would basically hold one wheel stationary with either keeping it on the ground or whatever, or putting wheel chocks underneath it, having the vehicle in neutral, and then on the other wheel, try to rotate it. It's not going to want to rotate because the limited slip clutch packs in there are grabbing. They've got preload on them. So it's going to take a certain amount of torque to actually force that wheel to spin. And I'll show you guys this stuff later. But the amount of force that it takes for the wheel to spin is the breakaway torque, and it should be like 40, 50 foot-pounds or more. And that's the number I threw out there, but it's going to take quite a bit of torque on that wheel that's up in the air while one wheel is stationary on the ground and the vehicle's in park and neutral to break that torque away. And if it's easy to break away, the clutches are worn out and you need to replace those, so you rebuild them. Now in this assembly here, this is that Eaton locker I keep talking about. And the Eaton locker is kind of a fancy setup here. It goes in a lot of GM trucks. There's a lot of GM truck owners that have it and they probably don't even realize it. And it's a locking mechanism that when one wheel goes a different speed than the other wheel by a couple hundred RPM, these little governor weights fling out, they'll grab onto this device called a latching bracket, and when it does that, there's a cam in here, and it causes these clutch packs to hyper compress, if you will, on each side, and it locks the side gears to the differential case. Once again, this is on another lecture, so I'm just kind of trying to answer the question. These things, if they're worn out, you have to go back with new clutches, and this plate, or this plug, if you will, this assembly here in the middle, that is selective, and it comes in a bunch of different sizes, and you actually need a special tool to go through and measure what size you need. If you don't get the right size in there, this thing won't work. At least it won't work properly. So yeah, it is common to rebuild these things, and we're kind of skipping through that and just dealing with the ring and pinion. But yeah, you would definitely want to deal with that diff case. And the same goes true with this ring gear. If I take this ring gear off, I take these bolts out, these ring gear bolts, they're not reusable. So I have to go back with new ones. The reason why is because these ring gear bolts aren't actually that big. They're probably 3/8 inch, studs there. And when I torque these down, they might be 60, 70 foot-pounds of torque. So that's a lot of force on a small bolt, and it stretches the threads. It kind of deforms the threads a little bit. If I try to go back, especially, I might get lucky and I might be able to tighten it up one more time, but if I try to do it twice, I'll probably rip the threads off and it won't be useful. So you're supposed to replace these ring gear bolts every time you take them off. If you take these ring gear bolts off, this gear won't just fall off there. There's a press fit. I'll have to use a brass drift and tap it off, which also means that when I go back together with a new gear, it's not just going to fall onto the differential case. What I do is I've got a little cookie oven, and I heat it up to 200 degrees. That's the temperature that it can live in the vehicle fine, so it's not going to hurt anything. And let it sit in there for 20, 25 minutes until it's golden brown on each side. That's a joke, but 20 minutes or so. And use some welding gloves, drop it down on there and get ready, because once it cools off, it's going to squeeze onto it, because it'll drop on there. Well, that heat will expand this gear enough to let it just fall right on. Get a couple bolts ready, start them. You don't have to tighten them, just get them started. And then once everything cools off, you can go through and tighten them all up. And when you tighten them, you want to do them in a sequence. You don't want to just start tightening this and go all the way around. You want to do it in steps, like maybe tighten a 20 foot-pounds first, do it in a star pattern. I'll take a paint pen and I'll mark it with one dot when I tighten one, and that's the first step. And then I'll make sure all of them have a dot on it and they've kind of gone random. And then I'll tighten it to the second, maybe 50 foot-pounds, and then I'll tighten it to its final torque. And so by the time I'm done, every one will have 3 paint pen dots and it'll be torqued down to the right torque. You want to do that because if you don't follow the steps in a sequence, you're going to potentially distort the case and also distort the ring gear. Does that make sense? Hopefully. All right, so I'm going to pound this bearing on. Now, you guys say a little prayer for me here, because this, I think, is burred over a little bit. I tested this by sliding this down, and you could see it goes down most of the way, but not all the way. So what could happen that's bad, and I've had this happen, is you start pounding this thing down, and then when you're done, the pipe's stuck on it, and it
Flip it over?
No, this is good. Yeah, well, this side I actually had at one time, I had to machine the inside of this out to make sure it fit out around this. That's why I put no hammer on this side, because this is the side that should fit, but it's already burred over a little bit. Now see if you can, I know it's probably the microphones hate this sound, but if it's coming through, you might hear a noticeable ping sound difference when this thing's bottom out. It's going to get a higher pitch and it'll be a lower pitch sound. We'll see if you can hear it. So right there, those last 3 hits I had were lower pitched. Hey, it came right off, no problem, so the prayer worked. But so here's my bearing and my shim in there. I usually try to look at that real close to make sure that there's no gap. I've seen it where people thought they pounded the bearing in all the way, but maybe the pipe or something hit a ledge and it didn't actually go down all the way. A little bit of oil on these gears are important, because we're now on our second step. We got our pinion depth set in there, and now we're going for pinion preload. So we're going to go back with our front bearing. These will all be new bearings, and I'm going to want to have a coating of oil on it. And matter of fact, I'm going to spin this axle housing around. So this is where some people will be like, all right, I can't reuse this collapsible spacer. I'm not supposed to. This is a one-time deal. But if you are really confident that this is going to set up and the gear contact's going to be good, go ahead and go in with your new collapsible spacer. If you are dealing with a nightmare of an axle, something that just wasn't set up right maybe, and you just don't trust it, and you don't even trust the shim that you put in is actually going to be the right one, you might want to reuse your old shim or your old spacer, but expect, when you're done, you have to have a new spacer in there. So you might go through the setup as if you're going to have to take it apart and change it again, just for the sake of of making sure you're not wasting parts. All right, so I'm going to put my spacer on. The same actually holds true with the seal. If you don't think that, if you think you might have to take this apart because it might not be set up quite right, you probably don't want to put the seal in until you know for sure. Now I can see just a couple threads, that's not quite enough. So if I can't, I'm just tapping this down. So that way I'm getting some threads exposed there. So hopefully that makes sense though. What I was trying to say is, like, if you don't have confidence in what your pinion depth is, how it's set up, you might want to reuse the spacer and not put the seal in case you have to take it apart again. But when you're done and you've got a good contact pattern, everything looks great, just take it back apart, put your new spacer in, your new sealant, and put it back together exactly the way you took it apart, and you'll be fine. So at this point right now, I've got my pinion in there with the proper shim, the collapsible spacer in there. I just reuse this one because we're not putting new ones in every time. And also, you put a new pinion nut, of course, reuse your old one if you don't know if you're got a good setup. And then I'm going to tighten this down. Now this is where this is where sometimes students get confused. It's like, how tight do I make this? And if you remember what I was saying earlier, since this uses a collapsible spacer, you're not going to find a torque spec in the service manual for this. You're basically going to be tightening this down until you can get the right turning preload on it. So, because what I'm doing in this process, now my spacer that's in there has already been crushed, as you know, because I reused it. But when I tighten this thing down, I'm going to be tightening this down until I can get the proper rotating torque. And what's the rotating torque? Well, that's our pinion preload. That's step 2. So step 1 was our pinion depth. We got a 39,000 shim in there, according to what the tool said. And then step number 2 is pinion preload, and that's what we're doing now. If this was set up like it's going in a vehicle, I would have a new collapsible spacer in there, and have the seal in, everything would be oiled. Matter of fact, one thing that I didn't even mention is I even put sealant, like pipe sealant, on the splines, because you don't want oil leaks to travel through the splines and out through the nut, because those aren't going to be perfect seals. So I'm going to tighten that down, and normally this would be over 200 foot-pounds. But because I'm reusing the collapsible spacer, I'm basically just bringing it back to where it was already crushed, and so the preload is pretty close to being right on. So I'm at that point now where I've got to do a preload check. These bearings are kind of rough. I'm getting about 20 thousandths, 20 inch pounds, not thousands, 20 inch pounds. This is why it's important to have oil on these bearings. And you have to kind of look at it as it's spinning around. It's not the breakaway torque. It's not the amount of torque that it takes for you to initially start rotating it. If you look, that's really high. That's like 45. Once I get it spinning, I'm looking at the dial and I'm trying to see what it kind of averages out at. Whoa. This is a tool that you will definitely need. So if you're a little backyard mechanic, whatever, you will definitely need to have a torque wrench because the preload isn't something you want to guess on. If you remember, the purpose of this preload is to put the clamp on this bearings, and it's to keep this pinion from moving around. If this preload is loose, this pinion, well, it might spin real easy. That's like best case scenario. But if it's really loose, this pinion could move around. And the way I like to explain this preload is like, it's like squeezing something together. It's less likely going to move, right? If I just hold on to something, it's going to move around. You can deflect it. If the tighter I squeeze something, the less likely it's going to be to move and deflect. But if I squeeze these bearings too tight, I'll overheat them and they'll fail. So that's the reason why the preload is something that you need to look at the specs and find out what they want you to have it set at. And on this axle here, they'll always give you a new and a used spec. And I see him measuring it right there. Side bearing, okay, I think it was probably on the previous page. All right, this one here says preload should be 20 to 25 inch-pounds on new bearings and 10 to 15 for used. So if you're reusing the bearings, the reason why they're a little lower is because they've already kind of set in, they've already established their little wear pattern. So right now I'm 20 inch-pounds. I'm going to remember that. So I think my pinion is set at the right preload and it's at the right depth. Now I'm at the point where I need to get my axle and drop the ring gear and the diff case in there and set up the backlash and the side bearing preload. If you remember my little list here, this is step 3. You guys see that? We've already finished pinion depth. We've already finished pinion preload, put little grease marks on there. And now step 3 is kind of a combined step, side bearing preload and backlash. So this is where I take my diff case. I got to do this carefully because I don't want to lose a finger. Again, Mike, you got your suture kit just in case? I hope. All right, so I'm going to drop this in. No shims or anything. At this point, I'm just putting my bearings and my diff case in there. If you remember early on in this presentation, towards the beginning, I mentioned that when you normally go back together with these, you would use this service spacer, and then you would use service shims. But because this axle has a little larger bearings, I can't use the service spacers that I have available. So what we're doing is we're improvising by using some of these shims here. I do have the larger shims, but I don't have any larger service spacers. And if I take a 260s and a 50, that's 170 thousandths, which is pretty much the same size as the service spacer that I would normally be putting in. So if I put this in to start with, kind of drop that in. Actually the 50 I have is a smaller one, but if I sandwich it between the two, it will still work okay. Then the other side, how do I know they're 60? Well, these are marked with 60, so whoever marked them, I hope they're right. Here's another 60. And I can't see now. Obviously, if you don't have a marking on it, you don't know what it is, you're going to have to measure it. And that's 50. Okay, so 170 thousandths on each side. This is, if you're doing this in the backyard or if you're doing this at a dealership, this is one of the ways that you can do it. It's very important that we get backlash set up properly and the clamp that's on these bearings set properly. If I don't, if I have my preload, these, you know, the same thing with the pinion, how we had to clamp those bearings down, put the right amount of preload on it, I have to do the same thing with these side bearings. If I don't have the proper preload, if it's too low, it can cause deflection of the gear case or the diff case here, so that can cause the ring gear to move in and out. Would that be bad? Or it could also, if I have it too high, it can overheat and wear my side bearings prematurely. So it's very important that I need to know what my side bearing preload is and if it's accurate, if it's within acceptable range. Also, the backlash, the amount of clearance that I have is very important. This thing's designed to run, if you remember, I think it said 5 to 9 thousandths backlash. If I ran it too loose, it would possibly be clunky, but also it would run the pattern off the heel and I would end up having a gear noise. If I run it too tight, when this thing heats up, it's going to lose its clearance and I'm not going to have room for oil and I'll overheat the gears. So this process here is what's called the shim method. If you bought an aftermarket gear in an install kit, you're going to have some kind of a mechanism or some kind of a sandwich design. Usually they have two shims with a bunch of thin shims that go between it. You just basically have to take them in and out and experiment with it. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put what we call a bent 40 thousandths on this side. This is the, I like to call this the pinion side because the pinion's offset to this side because the pinion's you got to make room in this axle housing for this pinion. So the ring gear is offset to that side, the pinion is offset to that side. The reason why I don't like to say right, left, and all that is because depending on how you mount these things on there, if I had this 180 around, my right and left would get mixed up. So if I'm looking at this, if I used to call this the ring side always, and this the pinion side, then I could just use those terms. But I put a purposefully bent shim, and I use a 40 thousandths shim because it's the smallest one, and it's going to work like a spring. And I might actually, and I'm going to go ahead and do this, I might have to pull one of the normal shims out because sometimes I just need that extra clearance, but not trying to confuse you guys on the steps here at all, but the purpose of the bent 40 thousandths shim is to work like a spring. So that way, because what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start filling up the ring gear side shims until I can basically have no backlash. And then I'm going to pull my bent 40 thousandths out and I'm going to fill up the pinion side of the diff case until I can't get those shims in anymore. The whole idea here is this little sequence to figure out how much shim do I need to fill from each side of this, each side of this diff case. I'm going to take up all the clearance, and then when I figure out what shim combination I have on each side, I'm going to make an adjustment for backlash, and then I'm going to add some for preload. You'll see it here in a second. So right now, I've got 170 thousandths of shims on the ring gear side, and I have about 120 thousandths of shim plus a bent 40 on my pinion side. So I'm going to start filling my ring gear side first because I'm going to want to take that backlash out. I'm going to use a screwdriver to kind of pry it open, give me a little space. And this is kind of a go by feel method here. I just grabbed a 66 thousandths. I'll double check that in a second. And I slid that in there. You probably can't hear it, but still got a little bit of backlash. And what made me start with the 66 thousandths? Well, when I stuck my screwdriver in there, that was about the thickness of the gap I saw. And otherwise, I would just be experimenting. I would just grab a shim. I'll switch over to the boom view here so you can see it. Okay, so yeah, I'm basically just filling this gap. I put the 66 in there. I'll verify that it was 66. That says 64. It's close enough. And then maybe go a little larger. No, I'll go to 68. Because I was really close with that. That says 66. Maybe I'm... And then also, here's a burr on this one, so I want to make sure I'm not using one that's going to act like a larger shim. How these things get burrs on them is the students end up using a hammer to pound them in as opposed to using a driver. And so you've got to be aware of that because you don't want your tools to screw you up. Okay, I slid that one in. Still just a tad. I'm going to go maybe to a 70. You might not get, like, you might just have a thousandths or so backlash. That's fine. But you don't want it to be bobbling back and forth real loose. All right, so we'll see what this does. All right, that's good. I think that's probably the right size shim. So right now I've taken out all the clearance that lives on this side because I don't have any backlash in my gear anymore. So what I'm going to do over here on the pinion side is I'm going to go back in with my shims and I'm just going to fill this up. Pretty much stuff whatever shims I can in here until I can't push them in by my hands anymore. And make sure I got the right ones. Start with my 170 thousandths. And then I usually start pretty low, like 40 thousandths or so, and work my way up. This is a 40 thousandth shim. This might actually be the one we need to start with because that's tight going in. So that's the smallest shim I got, and I could jam it in there, but I'm going to leave it at this. This is a 40 thousandth shim, and that's all that'll fit in there. So I have a 70 thousandth shim on this side and a 40 thousandth shim on this side. And in order to now, because basically with the 107, I'm going to write this down on this table here, I think. So that way we can kind of keep this math straight. Because what I have is my service spacer is 170 thousandths, so I've got that. That's that combination of two 60s and a 50. So I have 170 thousandths on each side. And then on this side I have 40 thousandths. So for a total of 210 thousandths on this side so far. On this side I put a 70, if I think I remember correctly. So that'd be 240 thousandths. But at this point, I have an axle that has no backlash and pretty much no preload. Because I've been able to fit these things in by hand, pretend that pushed in all the way by hand. So if I want to get backlash, I need to take 6 thousandths out of this side, because I'm going to shoot for 6 thousandths backlash. I'm going to take 6 thousandths out of this side and put it on that side. So I'm going to transfer 6. So I'll subtract 6 thousandths and I'll add 6. That should move this ring gear away from the pinion, right? Not getting all my hand action in there. So this should move the ring gear away from the pinion. Now that would give me my backlash, but it wouldn't give me my preload. So I'd have to add 4 thousandths to each side. And where am I coming up with these numbers? The 4 thousandths to each side is pretty generic. It's saying like any axle you work on, if you take all the gap up in this between the bearings and the housing and you add 4 thousandths to each side, you'll pretty much get the right preload. And where am I getting 6 thousandths? The minus 6 plus 6, it's usually about a 1-to-1 relationship. If I take a thousandths out from this side and put it on that side, it usually moves the gear over a thousandths of an inch. Or 6 out of this side, 6 out of that side, it should give me 6 thousandths backlash. So all these other numbers right here, these numbers right here are based on the axle. The plus 10 overall that occurs on this side, the plus 10 thousandths, let me erase, I just made a mess there. The plus 10 thousandths on this side, and then the minus 2 thousandths on this side, that is what we do once we get these numbers figured out. That's what we do to these numbers to get our side bearing preload and our backlash. So, going back to this, I should have written all over that. 210 plus 10, and then 240 minus 2, which is basically, I'll be putting a 68 thousandths shim on this side, because I already have the 170 in there, and I'll be putting a 50 thousandths or so on this side. Keep forgetting to put the 0 there, because I had a 40 in there to begin with. All right. Hopefully that didn't confuse you guys too much, but let's see how this works. The Dana method, Dana's system that we'll do tomorrow, it's a little simpler than this. It's probably good. They do use special tools, though, for better or for worse. So basically, I took out. No, I took the wrong one out. Hold on a second. That would have been bad. I took the 50,000s out. Use a little screwdriver to kind of spin these out of there. I'm going to verify that I took the right one out. Yeah. So I'm going to put a 68 in. Hopefully, if this thing all sets up right, I'll end up with the right amount of preload and the right amount of backlash on the first shot. What are the chances? A little low on small shims. We'll see how this works. This shim right here that I'm putting in, if I could put it in by hand, I know I didn't set, I know my measurements are not right, because I should have to pound this shim in, because it is, I've got an axle that needs to have side bearing preload, so this should not be able to just push in all the way by hand. I'll need to get my hammer and tap that in. Now they do have tools to do that with. This one right here is a side bearing shim installer. Kent Moore sells it. You'll see some people will go through and just hit these with a hammer, but remember that causes those burrs. These, I don't know if you guys know Chris Reynolds. He teaches at Lewis and Clark Community College. He had his brother make these for me, but Kent Moore does sell them. You see how I have to tap this in? Since I have to tap that in, I know I'm adding preload. And I added backlash. I don't want to check my backlash yet, although it does feel kind of high. I don't want to check it yet because it might not be sitting all the way down. So I want to tighten the bearing caps up a little bit. So there's two things I need to check once I have these shims in here. Even if that backlash was a little high, that doesn't mean all is lost, because if my preload is good, that shows me that all I need to do is do a little side-to-side adjustment on my shims. And even if my backlash was good, that doesn't mean I'm definitely good and done, because I need to go through and check my preload. So there's two things that these steps accomplished here. One was setting up preload and the side bearing preload, and the other one was setting up backlash. And if one's off, hopefully they're both good, but if one's off, the other is on, you just have to adjust for the one that's off. If they're both off, then it's, I don't know, it's kind of a guessing game. You have to make a educated guess. Okay, so I snug these up. Very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do my backlash check. Remember, the spec on this was 5 to 9 thousandths of an inch. I am getting 13 there, so I'm over. 13 looks, oh no, yeah, that was 13, 12 or 13.
And what would be the customer concerns with too much or too little backlash?
So the question was, what would be the customer concern with too much or too little backlash? Well, if I let it go with this, with too much backlash, the axle would probably have a gear whine, because that contact pattern would be coming off the heel. And so I wouldn't want to let it go this way. So I wouldn't even bother, and I mentioned this in our videos or lectures, there's no point in doing a contact pattern yet, because the backlash is off. So I need to make an adjustment for backlash. I'm at about 12 thousandths, so I'm off. Before I make any adjustment, I'm going to spin this around, and I'm just going to measure my preload. Because if my preload is good, then I know all I have to do is take whatever thousandths of shim I have on one side and transfer it to the other. But if my preload is off, then I need to maybe add a little bit more or subtract some from one of the sides as well. So let me just check that real quick. And so I'm getting about 25 inch-pounds of preload. And those of you guys, we recently went through this lecture. How do you figure out what good side bearing preload is? Well, there is an equation. I'm not going to go through all that with us right now, but the side bearing preload is the side bearing as the total preload, which I just measured at 25. Erase this. My total preload, that's everything, was 25 inch-pounds. If I subtract my pinion preload, which if you remember was 20 inch-pounds, the difference is 5. That doesn't mean my side bearings have 5 inch-pounds of preload. It means that measured at the drive pinion, my side bearings are showing 5 inch-pounds difference. But if you remember, it's going through this gear reduction. So if I go and look at my gear reduction, I've got 12 and a 41. Is that a 342? There's 12 pinion gear teeth, and there's 41 ring gear teeth. I told you guys I was good at math, and here I am doing this. Divided 342. So this is a 342 gear set. So I'd want to take that 5 inch-pounds of torque, that extra torque that it takes to spin the total unit versus the pinion by itself, and multiply it by 3.41 or 42, in which case that would be 17 inch-pounds. So that 17 inch-pounds is the preload that I have on these side bearings. It's actually not that bad. If you think of the pinion, used bearings could be 10 to 15, new bearings 20 to 25, used 10 to 15. Generically, we say that between 15 and 35 is what our side bearing preload should be. And we're at the low end of that. So if I want to decrease my backlash, so I need to remove shims from this side and add them to this side, I could remove, say, 6 thousandths from this side, and then add maybe 8 thousandths to that side. And that'll give me a little bit more preload if I wanted it, and a little bit more, or reduce the backlash. Do that real quick. See, this is the type of stuff, is the reason why you need to kind of go through a process. Now, usually when I demonstrate this in class, it works out perfect, but because I'm doing this on the internet, of course it's going to fight me a little bit and make me redo this part. But we're not that far off, so this is the trial and error. And if you don't have the shim kits like I'm showing here, which if you got an install kit from Randy's Worldwide or Summit Racing or something like that, you're not going to have this huge assortment of shims. What you're going to have is, like I said, a sandwich pack, if you will, where this shim is basically made up of 2 shims with a bunch of thin shims that you put in between. So you're going to have to write down sizes, put it together, measure it, and kind of tweak it accordingly. All right. Where my 3/4 inch wrench went? There it is. Remember, spin the axle housing out. Let's see what I can do by hand now. Yep. Sometimes you can spin them out by hand. Once you get one shim out, they're all loose. See if I can do it without hurting myself. Okay. So go back in with my, on this one I'm going to add 8 thousandths to, or wait, no, I don't want to add on this side. I think I did the math wrong. I said add, that would give me more. So I want to transfer shims from this side to that. So I had a 50. Let me double check my shims. See, See, that was a trick. I was seeing if you guys would catch that, and you didn't, so. This is the one that I put in. That was like a 56. There's a 50, 60, and a 6. Hold on a second. 52, 50, 60, and a 60. Okay. 60. I gotta make sure I get my 170,000 set up in there the way that was basically the equivalent of my service shims. And then on this side, I should have had like a 68 thousandths, I think, right? Does that sound right? 66, 68. Okay, so that one was the shim. These are the shims that were in there. I want to get this ring gear closer to the pinion to reduce the backlash. So I'll have to go smaller on this one by 6 thousandths. So if I had 50 to start with, I'm going to go ahead and put a 44 in there. Going over to my shim selection here, I'm trying to find a 44. I do have a variety of them, that's what's nice. And then I'll put that in. Like I said, the movement that we're trying to do here is we're trying to accomplish reducing our backlash primarily, and then maybe increasing our preload a little bit. And then this one's 64, so that 6 thousandths I took off of this side, I'm going to have to put on this side to move that ring gear over and keep my preload the same. But if I actually, instead of putting a 64, which was in it, I have to put the 70 thousandths. I might go 72. That'll give me a little bit more preload too. These things aren't in the right drawer. Go figure. It's nice having this assortment of shims, but man, they kind of make for a little bit of a mess at times. You get them laying out. All right, so once again, this will have to be pounded in because the preload's going to require that. It won't go in easily by hand. And there's my driver. Tap this in. That's in all the way. Put my bearing caps back on. Still feels a little loose to me, but we'll see what happens. If I can get it within spec, then we'll do a contact pattern and see what it shows. Contact pattern is the tell-all. It's the thing that if you don't have the contact pattern set right, then you will have an issue. All these steps that we're doing ahead of time, they're really there just to make sure that we're as close as possible. And then once we're at that point, we do the contact pattern. Our preloads are kind of set in stone. We're supposed to have the right amount of squeeze on those bearings. And but the backlash, that feels a little better. Let's see what we got. The backlash and the preloads are things that are going to be set in stone there, but this contact pattern is going to tell us if we have the pinion in the right position. Try to get this to stop moving on me. 8 thousandths. So it is within spec. I usually shoot for the low end of the spec, but we'll take it. So just for the sake of finishing this, that's 7 thousandths. Seven and a half. If you remember why I checked this in a bunch of different spots, is because if this gear is warped, maybe because I didn't tighten it properly or whatever, or it's mismanufactured or something's no good, that backlash is going to change. It's supposed to be maximum of 2 thousandths difference in any spot. So I don't want to just check it one spot, I want to check it in multiple spots. So right there, my backlash is good. It's 7 to 8 thousandths. We're going to run with that. I'm going to spin this around and just double check my preload. If you notice, I didn't get carried away torquing anything down really tight or anything like that. At this point, I'm just trying to go through and get this thing set up. And then when I'm done, I would go through and put the torque on the side bearing caps and so forth. Yep, the side bearing preload is still at 25 inch-pounds. I expected to go a little bit higher, but it didn't. That's okay, it's still within spec. If you remember in the lecture, we said that if you don't do the side bearing equation, that if you measure your pinion by itself, whatever you got, 15, 20, 25 inch-pounds, and then when you did the total assembly, you should be 5 to 8 inch-pounds higher than the pinion by itself. At that point, you know you're good. Now we have to do a contact pattern. I'm going to paint different teeth this time because I already painted those three the before, and we're not going to see too much of a change. Maybe the pattern will move more towards the center because we have less backlash in the way it was set up. That's our desired result. In class, a lot of times I'll tell the students to purposefully screw up the pattern, but since the backlash was off, we figured that one was kind of a good one to look at when we started. And then with this, the backlash now kind of back within spec, we'll be able to see if really the only thing we changed a 1/1000th worth of pinion shim, but for the most part it was just backlash that we changed. Okay, so remember, I got to do this without popping a tooth out. I got to go back and forth, and then I'm going to use my ratchet here to provide resistance. Oh, that's all right. I don't think I'm on my gear. Hold on. The disadvantage of painting only a few teeth is if you're doing this and you're not over the teeth, you're not going to see any marks. If you paint more teeth, you will see it. The socket doesn't like to fit on my pinion nut very well. That's why it's slipping off. That's my excuse. Okay, I'm going to reverse my ratchet because I don't know if I was on the coast side or the drive side. I am on the drive side now. Yeah, I believe. Let's see if I got it. I might have missed it, but we'll take a peek here. Oh, yeah. So now this pattern looks a lot better than the previous one because, let's see if I can get a good angle on it. Okay. So if you look, you can definitely see for one, the pattern is right here. Hopefully you could see that. Okay. It's not running off the heel anymore. You can still see paint there. It's not offset towards the face or towards the flank. If I were to reduce this backlash, it's at 7 or 8 thousandths. If I were to take it lower to maybe 5 or 6 thousandths, it'd be a little bit more offset towards the toe, but it is matching all the rules of a good contact pattern, where we want it to spend just as much time on the face as it does the flank. It's over half the length of the tooth. It doesn't run off the tooth in any direction, and it's kind of centered, but if it was offset towards the toe, it would make it even better. Now, if you notice, I usually don't spend time looking at the coast side too much. The coast side of this pattern does still look pretty good though. Actually, it looks great. It's right there centered. If I go back to the old pattern and see if it still shows, the coast side of the old pattern actually doesn't look that bad. Got a glare on that. Hold on. So the coast side of the old pattern actually doesn't look that bad. But if you remember, the drive side was running off the heel. It's back here. You can see I actually wiped the paint right off the heel. So backlash moved the pattern from the heel to the middle. And if I kept decreasing backlash even more, it'd offset towards the toe, which would be perfect. But this axle would for sure run, and it would be quiet. It wouldn't have much noise. So all told, it would be a good axle to put in a vehicle. And so that was a setup of this GM axle. We used the special tools. We used that thing called the shim method there, where you're basically doing shim swaps. I know there's a lot. Overall, the concept is, the details are simple. Pinion depth, pinion preload, side bearing preload, and backlash. It's all the mini steps that go on under each one that adds complexity to it. Remember things in generic terms though, so that way when you're trying to figure this out, one of the things I see students mix up is they think pinion preload is going to affect contact pattern, or they think side bearing preload is going to affect contact pattern. The only way those would affect contact pattern is if these parts are sloppy loose and they're moving around in there. But if I have pinion preload at 5 inch-pounds or 100 inch-pounds, the pinion's still in the same spot and it's going to create the same pattern. If I had side bearing preload at 5 inch-pounds or 100 inch-pounds, this diff case is still going to be in the same spot because it's sharing that load evenly on each side. So it's still going to put that ring gear in the same spot, so my pattern doesn't change because of preload. The only way the pattern would change is if these parts were so loose that they're physically moving around in there. And that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about when I say how could pinion, or what affects a contact pattern. The position of these gears are determined by the shim combinations I have on either side of this side gear, of this diff case, and the pinion depth shim, the one that lives underneath the head of the pinion. Now when we were doing this whole math and all this setup regarding the side bearing, I know there's a lot of shim swapping and all that stuff, but the general premise is when I go together with it, I'm filling this side up with shims until I got no backlash, then I'm filling this side up with shims until I can't fit them in there anymore. At that point, I'd have an axle that's completely filled with shims with no backlash and no preload. And then I would take 6/1000ths out of this side and move it to the pinion side, and that would move my ring gear away from the pinion, and that'd give me my 6/1000ths backlash. And then I'd take whatever I had in there now, I'd have 4/1000ths to each side, and that would squeeze on those bearings and give me my preload. So yes, that's the general concept. Now, me flipping shims and sticking screwdrivers in there and doing all that kind of stuff, that was just what I had to do to get those in there. And even this, like, I don't have the proper service spacer and all that kind of stuff. This was the wrong size, so I ended up using 3 shims instead of one of these. Do you think it really matters? I mean, look at it. Is it going to go anywhere? The shims are in there and they filled up the space. They're contacting the housing and they're contacting the bearing. They'd work perfectly fine. It also, if I did this math and I figured out I had a 246,000 shim on this side and I had a cast iron one that was that same size and I wanted to keep my shims and put this in the customer vehicle, by all means do it. Now, like I said, you read in the service manual, it'll say do not reuse these, but let's get realistic. This is just a piece of metal, and you push that thing in there, it's going to live in there, it's not going to go anywhere. These little ears that they have on these bearing caps, they keep anything from coming out. The axle shaft goes through the middle, so it's literally, it can't go anywhere. So I don't know why they say that. I would not be afraid to reuse these, even if it was cracked, as long as it goes in there and you don't break it in the process. It's not going to go anywhere once it's in there. So I don't want, there was a lot of complication in the details, but the overall process, I think, is relatively generic. And so try to focus on the concept is probably more so than the details. Are there any questions up there, Mike, that you can see?
Just if we're going to post this up, to where make the video available, and have we thought about maybe trying Zoom to try this as well? Post Zoom up.
Yeah, Zoom might work, but they have a time limit. Now, so I was worried about how long did this take so far. 2 hours, and it took 2 hours to do this. So I know Zoom has, I think, a 40-minute time limit, unless you have the pro version, which we don't have. The university, I think, gave out all their pro versions already.
We can get that for you.
So that is possible to do Zoom. The other reason why I wanted to do it on Facebook is because there were other schools that might wanted to watch this, And I know I could still share the Zoom link, though. That's still something that could be shared to anybody. So yeah, I mean, really, there's no reason why. As long as I got a pro version of Zoom. That's why I didn't want to use the D2L classroom either, because it would just be stuck to inside this class. But yeah, if we can get the pro version, then I could do this, the one for tomorrow and the ones next week, I could do that on Zoom. And then we could also record those and then put them up on Facebook and then YouTube for anybody else. So anyway, yeah, that's a good comment, good suggestion. Anything else?
That's all I'm seeing.
All right, well, if you guys have questions, you can email me, jeepster@siu.edu.
Join us tomorrow.
Join us tomorrow, 10 a.m. We're going to go through a Dana. The Dana axle uses different tools. Some of the concepts are going to be the same, so it'll probably go a little quicker. I won't have all these shims laying around. They're a little bit less, they're more tool intensive, but less pieces and parts intensive. And yes, tomorrow, 10 a.m., Dana axle. Be there. Just email me or post up a question if you have one.